All right, hello, welcome everyone to the Understanding the Quality Level of a Wine webinar. My name is Julia Lambeth. I'm one of the full-time educators at WSET School London. So WSET School London, you may or may not have heard of. We are one of the APPs for the WSET. APP means we are an approved programme provider, of which there are many in various countries around the world. We are often described as the flagship APP for the WSET, being just around the corner from the offices in London Bridge. So we have a school on Bermondsey Street where we host all of our wine, spirit, sake qualifications. I've been an educator here for a few years now, having completed my level 3 and then level 4 a number of years ago. So I now teach across all the wine qualifications, but also have a strong interest in spirits and sake too. However, for today, we're just going to focus on talking about wine. While some of the stuff we're going to cover as part of this session will also be relevant to spirits or sake, there are also some differences. So we're going to stick with a little wine focus for this session. In terms of how the session is going to run, I've got my little presentation, so I'm going to talk you through that. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A, and I will have a look at those at the end and try and answer as many of those as I can. Otherwise, you can pop any other comments in the chat. This is being recorded, so if you do miss any, or if you want to watch it again later, then it will be available on the WSET School London YouTube channel. That's all the admin out the way, I think. So let's get going. So the topic is quality for today. So I guess I just wanted to start with thinking about why is quality important? You can very much enjoy a wine, taste a wine without thinking about its quality. Certainly anyone who's done a level 1 course with us would have done just that. You can think about the structure and the flavour and not need to make a judgment at the end of it. However, for our level 2 and level 3 courses, that starts to change, and that's where we do bring in quality judgments to the tasting note as well. So I've got a few ideas of thinking about why quality is important here. First off, just to give us a way to evaluate wines when we're tasting them, it's quite useful to think about what's better in terms of quality for one wine compared to another wine, in a way that is impartial to an extent. So having a framework to think about quality can be really useful, and this is both when you're tasting wines just as a consumer, or if it happens to be part of your job. There are several things that we can think about that will help us understand this. And as I said, well, as you can see there, it's also a way to compare and contrast wines. So if you've got two wines that are similar in terms of perhaps where they're from or how much you paid for them, what is it that you can look for that will then be as an indicator of which is better quality? How can you help pick that out? So those are the sort of things we're going to be considering here. Now, before we get into talking about quality, I've got a little poll for everyone here that's attending. So I'm just going to launch that now, and I'd love to get your ideas. The question is, which of the following indicate the quality level of wine? And you've got a few different options there. So I'll give everyone a few seconds just to think about those. So we've got some options here, which are the label, the price, the weight of the bottle, whether you like it or not, and sealed with a cork. So I can see, oh, we've got quite a few people responding. Thank you very much for participating. I'll give that another few seconds just to settle out. The label is winning by far at the minute. Weight of the bottle, not getting so many votes. All right, that seems to be slowing down. So it looks like from your responses, More people have gone with the label as being an indicator of quality, followed by the price, whether you like it or not, followed by sealed with a cork, and then the weight of the bottle at the end. Now, what I need to tell you is it's actually a bit of a trick poll. None of these things are really actually going to tell you that much about the quality of a wine. So sorry to mislead you there a little bit. But it is a good starting point for us to see what are the things that maybe we take as cues, and from here we can talk a little bit about, well, why they're not so useful, I guess, for all of these things. So end that there. We can move on to the next slide. So what quality is not at WSET? So as we have our specific way of tasting at WSET, that's the framework that I'm going to use as this presentation. So what is not is based on price, as we just said from that poll. Price can be a bit of a clue, but it is certainly not the be all and end all when it comes to thinking about the quality of a wine. You could take two wines at the same price from different regions, and they could be very different in terms of quality. Paying a lot of money does not guarantee that you're going to get a top quality wine. So there are other things that we're going to look for that are going to help us decide on that. Quality is also not personal preference. So knowing whether you like a wine or not is really useful for each of us as an individual, but it's not going to really be an example of quality necessarily. I don't know, it depends on your palate. Maybe you only like high quality wines. If so, good for you. But when we're thinking about communicating quality to other people and judging that at a WSET level, we're trying to remove our personal preference from it. So it's not whether I like it or not, we're looking for the other sort of structural parts of the wine. The other things that were on that poll included the label, or I mean, we've all been sucked in by a good label before. People pay a lot of money to have good labels, don't they? So again, that's a nice thing to notice, that it doesn't really tell you much about the overall quality of the wine. Closure was on the poll as well. There still seems to be a bit of a bias towards assuming that wine sealed with a cork will be better, which is not necessarily always true. And then the one that most of you didn't fall for was the weight of the bottle. Again, I'm sure you've seen these big old heavy bottles in the shop. They do feel more premium, they feel more expensive, and they're going to have cost more to weigh that much, but that doesn't necessarily equate to what's going on inside the bottle. A couple of other things that quality is not, that I've got on the slide here. We're not looking just for a wine that's a great example of its type. So we're not looking, if you think about a grape variety like Pinot Grigio, just because it's the best Pinot Grigio you've ever tried, it doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily an exceedingly high quality wine. So we're not thinking about that scale for each variety or each region. And we're also not thinking about whether it's just doing a good job. To take that example of a Pinot Grigio again, if it's just an inexpensive Pinot Grigio that's light, that's got some simple flavors, but it's doing those really well, that doesn't make it high quality. So just because it's doing what it's supposed to do also isn't necessarily connected with quality. Though, you know, from a business perspective, that's certainly what you're going to want from your wines. So now that we know the things that it's not, let's think about what we actually are looking for. So here we're talking about how we determine quality at both WSET level 2 and level 3. So while we do look at slightly different things across tasting at level 2 and level 3, how we reach the conclusions is actually pretty similar. So what we're going to do when we're thinking about trying to define the quality of any wine is use our systematic approach to tasting, SAT for short. So in the picture here, you can see an example of the SAT at level 2. So we go through in a systematic way, as the name suggests. We look at the appearance, then the nose, and then the palate. And what you're doing at each of these stages is essentially gathering evidence. All the information you pick up at each of these stages is going to help you when it comes to your quality conclusion. You're not just picking a word at random when it comes to your quality level. It is based on the evidence in front of you. Think of yourself as a little wine detective. You are using your senses, your sense of sight, smell, taste, to put together the clues that you're going to need to help you decide on the quality level at the end of it. So you need to be familiar with the systematic approach to tasting at whichever level you're looking at. And then you need to write a tasting note. So here you want to, go through in order, write down as much of the details as you can. And then, as we said, that's your evidence. And then to come to the quality conclusion, what you're going to think about are the 4 criteria that you can see on the slide there, which are balance, length, intensity, and complexity. And it's these 4 criteria which are going to help us come to our quality conclusion. So what we're going to do is talk about what each of these 4 things are and how we're going to figure that out from our tasting note. And then we'll bring that together to think about how we can apply that to the quality level. So when you're writing your tasting note, as we said, this is your evidence. So you want it to be a good tasting note to start with, because if you don't write an accurate tasting note, that's going to skew everything to come. So you want to be in the correct environment to start with. So that means good natural light. It means the correct size tasting sample. So at WSET School London, we always use our ISO glasses, and we'll have a 50 ml sample, which is just enough to give you space to swirl it round in the glass, to smell it and taste it, take a few sips to taste it accurately. You also want to make sure that you, and as a taster, are in the correct state for tasting. So that means you've not just had any particularly strong food or coffee, or if it's in the morning that you can still taste your toothpaste. You don't want any of those things to be interfering with your ability to taste. Once that's all set up, what you want to do is make sure you're using a consistent technique every time. So that's why we would always use the same glassware, why we'd always pour the same amount of wine into every glass, is in order to make sure that we're comparing like for like. If you start doing different things, then it's going to be harder to ascertain if any differences in the wine are due to your technique or due to differences in the wine. And again, this is why having the SAT is really useful. The systematic approach to tasting does ensure that we're going to use the same process every time and make sure that we will have those accurate comparisons. Speaking of comparisons, it can be useful to compare wines side by side. When we're tasting wines, sometimes trying a wine in isolation can be a little bit difficult to help you understand differences in intensity, differences in complexity. So when you've got one or more wines next to each other, going back and forth between them will normally reveal any differences on those things. So when you are tasting, when you're writing a tasting note, having a couple of wines can be quite useful. And let's face it, the more wine, the better, normally, right? Little question at the bottom there for open or blind. So this means when you're tasting wines, whether you're thinking about quality or just tasting for fun or for any other reason, you can either taste the wines open, where you know what it is. You'll have got some information from the label perhaps, or you'll know where you bought it from, how much you paid, or maybe you spoke to the person in the shop who sold it to you. And then you can use that information in conjunction with your tasting note and think about whether that makes sense for what you know about it, what you're expecting from it, and then still use your tasting note to help you come to the quality assessment. Or you can taste it blind. Well, this normally requires the help of someone else to put it into a blind bottle or into a glass for you, so you then do not know what the wine is. When you're tasting wines blind, this can be a very different experience because you're removing all of your preconceptions. You remove what you know about the grape variety or the price or the region or the winemaking, so you have to then just go on your senses. Either approach is good. In fact, normally we want to be having a mixture of two because it can reveal different things about wines if you taste them in different ways. But the process will be the same either way, working through that appearance, nose, palate to get to your conclusion. So for our 4 criteria that I mentioned already, then let's have a little talk through each of these and think about what it is that we're looking for. So the first of those is balance. So anyone who's done a level 2 course or maybe a level 3 course, it's one of the things we talk about a lot when it comes to wines. And actually, it's the thing that is normally most present in most wines. So when we're talking about balance, as you can see from the little image of the scales here, we're talking about making sure that the wine is harmonious, that all of the different parts of it are working together. And if you think about the scales being in the picture there, you can think about sweetness and fruitiness being on one side of the scale, and then acid and tannin being on the other side of the scale. So it's those key parts that we're really trying to balance out. So if you have a lot of sugar in the wine, if it's very sweet, we normally want acid to give that freshness, to make sure that it's balanced and not sticky or cloying. If you have a lot of tannin in your wine, tannin gives you that drying sensation over your teeth and gums, then you normally want some fruity flavour to balance that out instead. In some places where they have very high acid wines, for example, in some of the cooler parts of Germany, they historically had very high acid. Well, in that case, they would then use a bit of sweetness to balance that out. So they're just different things that you can use, different ways that you can think of achieving balance. Balance is the job of the winemaker. So they do have different tools that they can help them achieve that. And when we're thinking about balance, it's also useful to think of it on a bit of a scale. In your tasting notes, you don't need to specifically state this in writing or anything like that, but you can think about some wines as being just about balanced and some wines as being exceptionally well balanced. So balance is normally achievable. As I said, it's the job of the winemaker, but there will be some wines that are better balanced than others. And as you build up your tasting experience and you think about which wines are the best balanced that you've experienced and which wines are maybe only just about there, then that can help you as a little bit of a clue to quality. If it's really harmonious, if you've got that perfect balance, then you probably know you're looking at a higher quality wine. If it's only just about balance, then maybe that's giving you a clue that it's actually going to be in the lower quality realms. The next thing we can think about is the length or finish. So this will be evident from your tasting notes. So when we talk about the finish on the palate, you will have written down what you think that is. How we figure that out is simply by thinking about how long the pleasant flavours of the wine last for. There's a couple of important points in that sentence. The first off is that it's flavours that we're thinking about here. So you're not including the structure in your consideration of the finish. So that's not then including sweetness or acidity or tannin or any of those things. It's just the flavours that count towards the finish. The other important part of that sentence is that it's the pleasant flavours that we're looking for. So if you find that the finish has a lot of bitterness to it, particularly at the end of the finish, then that would mean it's probably shorter than if it did not have that bitterness to it. So you want to make sure it's tasting nice, really. Another clue can also be thinking about how many different flavours you can pick up on the finish, how long all of those flavours last for. If you find that the finish just sort of tails off and you've got just one flavour that you're really picking up, that's not really enough to call it a finish, because you want to be tasting all the things that you did at the beginning all the way through to the end. So again, if you end up on that one note or one aroma, one flavour characteristic, then you're probably going to the finish a bit shorter than maybe you would do otherwise. So all of these things are going to be clues that we can use to figure out how long we want to say the finish is. Now, for something where we are describing it in terms of a length of time, there is actually no defined length of time for what constitutes a short or medium or long finish. So this is one of those things where, again, a little bit of experience is going to come in handy. Once you start tasting a few wines and you compare them side by side, you will start to notice some wines are longer and some wines are shorter. For me, a short finish would be literally a couple of seconds normally. The flavours kind of just disappear quite quickly, and I'll know to call that a short finish. Medium finish goes on longer, obviously. I don't tend to time them, even though I've put a picture of a little stopwatch on here. I'd be thinking in the realms of 10 to 15 seconds for a medium finish, and then longer than that for a long finish. For anyone who's had a look at our level 3 SAT or considering going on to that, you will notice that for medium, we actually have more options than just one. So if you think a finish is medium, then you have the options of medium minus if it's the slightly shorter end of medium, or medium plus if it's the slightly longer end of medium. So it does get a little bit more complicated at level 3. But the useful way to think about this is you always start on your 3-point scale. So start with short, medium or long, and then only if it's medium do you consider whether it might be straight down the middle medium, slightly lower end of medium, or slightly higher end of medium. And this is really because a lot of things end up being medium. If you start writing your tasting notes and it's all medium, 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 it's not going to tell you necessarily that much. So having a little bit more of an ability to be descriptive around the medium category will help in terms of our understanding, in terms of the accuracy of our tasting note. So the finish is a particularly important part of your tasting note to make sure that you are aware of, and make sure that you're trying to get that accurate. Next, we can think about intensity. So with intensity, again, we'll look at our tasting note, and our tasting note has the options of light, medium or pronounced at level 2, and at level 3, again, we include that medium minus and medium plus in the medium option. So intensity is a combination of a number of things. So it will, to an extent, be how strong the aromas or flavours are. But it's not just about how easy you can smell whether there's wine in the glass. There will be some wines where you can smell there's something about it, you can smell there's wine in front of you, but until you can actually define what those aroma characteristics are, that's not intensity. So if you find you get to a wine where you can smell there's something there quite easily, but actually it's not that very easy to define them until you really get your nose right in the glass. I'm holding a fake glass to clarify that. Then those are different things. So when you're thinking about intensity, it's not just how strong the aromas or flavours are, but also how well defined those flavours are. If you've got really specific aromas, flavours, you can really clearly tell that you've got different fruits, you've got different spices. Or is it more generic, more vague? Can you smell there's some red fruits, but actually you can't really tell apart what those different red fruits are? Or maybe there's a more confected nature to the fruit and it's not as clear as it could be. If those are the sort of things you're getting, then that's going to be an indicator that it may not be that high in intensity. The more definition you have, the more clearly you can pick out each of those flavours and aromas, the more intensity you're going to be looking at. Another clue can be how many flavours there are, or aromas there are. This is sort of bleeding into the next point, which will be complexity, but the two things are often correlated. So you can use a little bit of that to help reinforce your idea for intensity. So really, if we've got a lot of well-defined aromas and flavours that are very strong, then that would be pronounced in intensity. If we've got a few aromas, flavours, which we can't really define that well, they're a little bit vague. Maybe you've got to the stage of red fruits, as I said, but you can't really pick out what those are, then that's probably going to be light intensity. And if we're somewhere in the middle, where you've got some aroma that you can pick up, it's got some definition, but it's not that strong, then that would be your medium intensity. A little clue here that can help you is thinking about how close to your nose does the glass have to be before you can start to pick out the definition of the aromas in the wine. This is, again, something that we all vary in terms of our sensitivity. So for me, a wine that is very light in intensity would mean that I've got my nose all the way in the glass. I have to sniff quite hard to get those aromas out. A wine that is more medium intensity would normally mean my nose is on the edge of the glass. And then a wine that's pronounced intensity, I probably smell with my nose just outside the glass. Other colleagues have slightly different frameworks. I've got a colleague who starts at a chin. If you can smell the wine when the glass is at chin level, then that would be pronounced. If you can smell it when the glass is at lip level, then that would be medium. And if you can smell it only when the glass is near your nose, then that would be light. So that's slightly different in terms of sensitivity. That's for a more sensitive nose than mine is. So again, when you start kind of thinking about these things and you start comparing wines, you can work out which of these works best for you. There is no one size fits all when it comes to these things. As part of what is fun about wine tasting, we're all going to be slightly different and experience things in different ways. So part of your challenge here is working out what works for you. What are your sensitivities? And that brings us on to the next point, which is complexity. So for complexity, we're thinking about the number of aromas and flavors that we're going to be able to find in the wine. So on the slide here, you can see an example of a level 2 lexicon, which has a number of potential aroma and flavor descriptors on it. These are, as I say, potential aroma and flavor descriptors. This is not all of the aromas and flavors you're ever going to find in a wine. It's a useful reference to start, as most of these are normally going to be pretty universal. They're normally things that most people have come across and have an idea of what that might be. So when you are starting out with tasting, it's quite useful to have a list like this in front of you. And you can, again, be systematic with it. Start at the top with floral. Do you smell any floral? If yes, which floral? If no, then maybe move on to the next category and keep moving down and thinking to yourself, do I smell this in the wine that's in front of me? There are some rules of thumb that we normally observe. Things like white wines will normally be a combination of green fruit or citrus fruit, stone fruit, tropical fruit, but generally don't have red fruit and black fruit. Whereas red wines, it will be the other way around. Normally red fruit and or black fruit, but won't have green fruit, citrus fruit, stone fruit, tropical fruit. You can also see we have the SAT divided into primary, secondary and tertiary layers on the SAT there. So primary are those that come from the grape variety fermentation. Secondary are those that come from winemaking. So this is where the winemaker has done something that has changed the character of the wine, added flavors to it. And you can see there we've got 3 different processes that are possible: yeast or lees contact, malolactic conversion, and oak. And again, there are some rules of thumb here in that red wines, if we're thinking about secondary characteristics, it's really just going to be oak. We're not going to expect to notice any aromas from yeast or malolactic conversion. Whereas with white wines, it could be all 3. So part of what you are testing when you're smelling or tasting the wine is which of these processes have been used. What can I smell in the wine, and what does that tell me about the winemaking? That in itself doesn't necessarily link to quality just yet, but again, it's a clue. The more things that have been done to the wine, the more aromas and flavors that are added are going to increase the complexity, and that is the clue. And then the tertiary aromas and flavors at the bottom there, those are characteristics that come from maturation. So if you have a wine that's been left in bottle for years, normally we'd be expecting, then the wines will develop new flavors. And again, you can see different characteristics for red wines versus white wines there. And those will also vary according to the particular grape variety, how long it's been left for. So there's a number of different possibilities there. So if you have a wine that's got primary and secondary and tertiary characteristics, that's normally going to be pretty complex because you'll be getting lots of different aromas from each of those categories. But that does not mean to say that a wine has to have primary and secondary and tertiary in order to be complex. It is possible if you have just primary, for example. A lot of people think that a wine cannot be complex if it's only primary characteristics, but I am here to tell you that's not true. What we need to look for is the number of different clusters. So by clusters, I mean the sort of categories on the left here. If you've got a wine that has floral and green fruit and citrus fruit, stone fruit, tropical fruit, herbaceous, herbal, other, if it's got all of those different things in it, then that's complex purely because it's still got a lot of different aromas and flavors. It doesn't matter that they all come from the primary section. What matters is the number of different identifiable aromas and flavors. So don't fall into that trap of thinking that wines that are just primary in terms of their characteristics are simple or lacking complexity. Some of them will be, but not all of them will be. So you want to make sure that when you come across a wine that has that complexity, that you can identify it and you're not going to overlook it just because it's not got any oak or showing any age or anything like that. So at the end of our evaluation of complexity, well, I should say at the start of our evaluation of complexity, this is again using the evidence from our tasting note. You may find that you don't write down all of the aromas and flavours that are possibly there in a wine every time. You're normally going to jot down a few ideas, maybe the things that are most noticeable to you, but there could be other things that you can smell or taste in the wine that you don't write down. Maybe you can't articulate all of them very easily, or maybe you've just written enough already. So here is where we're using everything we can smell and taste regardless of whether or not you've written it down. So if you haven't written everything down, you still want to be including the things that are not maybe defined or that you haven't yet identified. So the options, as I've said, we can have some wines that are going to be more simple, some wines with some complexity, and some wines are going to be very complex. So a simple wine would be one that just does not have a lot of aromas and flavours to it. So if you can only get a few different things, I know 3, 4 aromas that you're comfortable picking up, maybe they're not that easy to define. Maybe they're a little bit generic. That's going to be a clue. Simple wines can, in theory, be just primary or primary and secondary. So don't rely on the fact that having some oak in the wine makes it better necessarily. There are ways in which you can make wines using oak, which, you know, is a cheaper cut price. Thinking about things like oak staves or oak chips, they might add a little bit of flavour, but it's not enough to necessarily guarantee complexity. So if we were thinking about a wine with some complexity, then that's got a few more flavours, things that we can pick out, more different clusters that we're able to identify. And then a complex wine would mean we've got lots of different things that are identifiable, a number of different clusters that we're picking those aromas and flavours from. So that's actually quite a lot of things to think about when it comes to pulling all of these strands of our tasting notes together. So what we're going to do then is use these criteria, and at WSET we have a scale that goes from poor to acceptable, good, very good, or outstanding. And essentially we're using these 4 criteria to help us pick one of these words. How we often do it in the classroom is use these criteria as a little bit of a scoring system. So if a wine is well balanced, it's got pronounced intensity, it's got a long finish, and it's complex, then that is going to be 4 out of 4. It's showing high levels on all of those criteria. It's got everything we're looking for, in fact, so that's going to be outstanding quality. If a wine has 3 of these things at a high level, but is maybe missing one of them, then that would be very good. So maybe if the wine is well balanced, it's pronounced with a long finish, but actually isn't that complex, that would be very good instead. Good quality wines would be where we've got a couple, just 2 of those things that we can pick out, but we're lacking a couple of other things. So maybe it's a wine that's well balanced and it's got a little bit of complexity. It's got a little bit of intensity, but neither thing to a particularly high level. Then here is where you can start using some half marks, if you like. So a wine that's medium intensity could be a half mark, and a wine that's medium complexity could be a half mark. And then you add that all up and you've got a wine that would equate to 2 marks overall. So that's good quality. Acceptable would mean that there's not too much to talk about with this wine. If it's acceptable, it would mean there's only one thing that's positive that we can pick out of those criteria. And if there's only one thing, that normally means it's balanced. So balance, as we've said already, is the job of the winemaker. It's the thing that's guaranteed with the wine. So if we can say it's well balanced, but it's lacking on all of the other things, then that is where we would use the word acceptable. And then poor is if it's not even balanced. So it's not very often that you're going to come across a poor wine if you're buying your wines from a shop or a bar. You know, it's as I've said, not only the job of the winemaker, but then the job of the wine buyer to ensure that wines are at least acceptable quality. So most of the things that we buy in the shop should be at least acceptable. You may come across things every now and again that are not. So now at least you have your framework for what you're looking for. So this is a very specific way of judging quality. We put all of the wines that we taste into one of these words. They're going to be the quality level that we choose. It does mean that they're quite broad categories. You can certainly have wines that are 2 wines that are called outstanding, and you might still think that one is better than the other. But we're looking at these wines in the context of all wines in the world. So they will both be outstanding compared to the acceptable wines, the wines that are much lower in terms of quality, that don't have those things that we're looking for. So if you do think a wine is outstanding, it doesn't have to be the most outstanding. Don't then downgrade it to very good just because it's not the best that you've ever tasted. So try and keep in mind that we're going to, if we think about all of the wines in the world, they're going to fall into normally one of these categories. So we've got quite an even split between acceptable, good, very good, and outstanding. So that does mean that you're going to get some slight variances within them. Now, I've put at the bottom, there are other quality ratings that exist. As I said, this is very much what we do at WSET, but it doesn't mean that you have to do that for what you're doing if you're tasting wines at home or what other businesses do. You can see numeric scores in some places, scores out of 20 or scores out of 100. Those are sometimes used to give you a different idea of quality. If you've got a wine that's 99 or 100 out of 100, then that would be pretty good. If you're looking at something that's in the 80s, then that would normally indicate something that's lower quality. Often with these 100-point scores, it should be said that most of the wines are going to be in the sort of 80 to 100 bracket. You rarely get wines that are 30 or 40, so it's still actually maybe a bit more of a narrow bracket than you might expect by looking at it to start with. Some places will give medals for wines, so you might see bronze, silver, gold, platinum medals. So that's again just a different way of articulating a similar thing. So you'll get a gold medal will be for the better wines, but the bronze medals would be for your sort of generally maybe good quality wines instead. So when you are tasting wines, if you do see a score on it or you see a medal on it, you can then use that again to be a bit of a clue. But at the end of the day, you've got to think about those 4 criteria when you're tasting the wine, and whether you agree with it. Really, you can disagree with the medals and the scores if you want to. So to get confident at this, to get precise with this, practice is key. I know when it comes to tasting, people can find it a little bit difficult at first, particularly when it comes to recognizing aromas and flavors. Sometimes other things like intensity can be challenging in some wines than others, but the more wines you taste, the more you keep at it, the easier it is just to get into good habits and to make sure that you are recognizing things correctly. If identifying aromas and flavors is something you find tricky, you can practice by smelling or tasting different fruits or spices or vegetables. Most of us in our everyday lives are surrounded by things, you know, we eat a lot, we cook a lot, probably. So if you use the things that you have at your disposal and get used to smelling those things, tasting those things, you're building up your memory, building up your sense of smell. So the next time you experience that in a wine, it should be easier for you to pick out. But don't worry if it's not something that comes easy to you. It doesn't for most people, I can promise you that. And again, once you get used to tasting, you get used to working through in this systematic way, then you'll be able to more easily recognize those different quality elements that we're looking for, more easily be able to compare things for intensity or finish, and help build this sort of mental portfolio of wines and this mental way to assess different qualities. And then I put at the bottom, tasty is fun, because it is, isn't it? If you've got some time and some wine to taste and you want to write a nice little tasting note and think about it, it's normally an enjoyable activity. So that brings us pretty much to the end now. So if you are thinking about signing up to a WSET qualification, you can find our ones at WSET School London through our website. So we have multiple courses for both level 2 and level 3, and we run them in a number of different formats. So this includes weekday, both consecutive courses where you'll do, for a level 2, it's 3 days in a row, for a level 3, it's 6 days in a row, or you can do the 1 day a week option. We do evening sessions, which is just the 2-hour evening over a number of weeks. Saturdays are just over 4 hours, or the online courses you can register for as well. The online courses are slightly different in that you don't have lessons in the same way. It's more self-guided, but a lot of people find this useful to fit around their lives or fit around their agendas in a way that works for them. If you are thinking about booking onto a level 3 or you want to know a bit more, just bear in mind that it is expected that students have a level 2 knowledge before attending level 3. So this either means that you've completed the level 2 course, or if you think you have a good amount of knowledge already, there is an entry exam that you can do just to make sure that you are at that level before moving on to the level 3. Otherwise, it'd just be a bit too much of a jump, really. So it is a benefit for everyone to make sure they have that level of knowledge before they go on to the level 3. So that does bring me to the end of everything I'd planned. I'll have a little look at the questions now. If anyone has any questions they want to type up, please do. Can see there's a couple in there already. So the first one says, are you able to take your SAT lexicon into your tasting exam, or does this have to be memorized? The answer is you are not allowed to take it into your exam, and it does have to be memorized. There is, in fact, I believe it's still there, a small line on your SAT card that says you do not have to memorize this. I'm going to argue that that's wrong. You do. I should say that it's only the level 3 courses where you have to do tasting as part of the exam. If you're just thinking about level 2 courses, then you don't have to worry about that. The level 2 is purely theory based for the exam. But for the level 3 course where you do have to taste, it has to be done from memory. So you have to remember what goes into each part in terms of appearance, nose, palate, and the specific terminology that you will be required to write to answer correctly. Okay, next question. Did you mention that tertiary group relates to meat flavours? I missed the word meat. Why? Can you elaborate more on tertiary scent? And that's a very good question. I mean, meat is an example of a tertiary characteristic that is often used for red wines. It's not something that you'll find in every red wine that's got some age. It's often related to particular grape varieties. Something like a Syrah, Shiraz can often have a meaty characteristic to it. How these characteristics get there, I mean, that's just part of the magic of wine, really, isn't it? That's a combination of how the aroma compounds in the wine change over time inside the bottle. We can find that certain grape varieties elicit certain characteristics, but it tends to be part of a varietal character. Meat can be used just as a separate characteristic. It doesn't have to be, it's different to leather, or sometimes people say game or other characteristics. So it's just an example of a possible tertiary characteristic. If you don't find that wines ever smell meaty to you, it's not something you have to use. The good thing about tasting is that there are enough different aroma and flavour characteristics that if one of them doesn't make sense for you, if you don't know what that is or you don't pick it up, there'll be something else that you can use instead. So if it doesn't make sense to you, just don't use it. Come across every now and again people who have just never smelled a certain thing. Elderflower seems to happen every now and again. If you've never smelled elderflower in a wine, you're probably not going to describe a wine as smelling of elderflower. That is okay. The next question says, are you expected to identify grape variety or wine at level 3 tasting exam? And the simple answer to that is no. All you have to do at the level 3 tasting exam is accurately describe 2 wines. You will be given 1 white wine and 1 red wine. You need to write the appearance, nose, palate, quality level for it, and that is it. In fact, it will be very much better for you if you try not to guess what the grape variety or wine is. What tends to happen is when people try and guess what it is, they write a tasting note for their guess rather than for the wine they're actually tasting. So people can get it very wrong if they try and make a guess without when they don't need to, and then they miss the evidence that's actually in the glass in front of them. So my best piece of advice, if you do find that you're in a tasting exam and at the level 3 tasting exam and you've got it in your head that you think you know what it is, you just try and give yourself more options. If you think it's a Sauvignon Blanc, what else could it be? What else has floral aromas and high acidity? Could it maybe be a Riesling or a Torrontés? You know, there will always be more options. So broaden it out rather than narrow focus in on a particular wine. And hopefully that way you won't get drawn down the wrong path. Okay, I think that is then all of our questions. Unless anyone has any final things they want to add. Otherwise, I will say thank you for joining me this afternoon. I hope you found that useful. And I hope you will go on to use all of that to do some more tasting for yourselves. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon and maybe see you at a course or an event soon. Thanks. Bye.